This is a pre-reading session about the novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, where we'll look at the history and the context surrounding the story, as well as the writer Chinua Achebe. That means if you haven't finished the book, or if you haven't even started, it's not a problem. If you've been set this book for IB, it can be a challenge, in part because it requires knowledge of a history that isn't often taught in schools outside of Africa. That means you're also very lucky. You'll find that understanding post-colonial studies, as well as some of the darker facts about European history, will set you up really well, especially if you're planning to study internationally. I would imagine in general you've probably learned more about European monarchy and the American Civil War. In terms of African history, it doesn't often tend to extend beyond something like the ancient Egyptians. So I'm going to introduce you to a few things today, but I've also got a reading list on this QR code here. I'll point you towards those at various points, but in general I would advise going through some of the documents on this reading list to really educate yourselves in terms of African history to an extent that I'm not able to cover in this short video. So I mentioned that word post-colonial literature there, which is a whole section of literature which deals with the experiences of individuals and cultures in the world after colonialism. For a working idea of colonialism, all you need to know for this video is that it involves European countries generally laying claim to certain areas, often those which could be exploited for their natural resources or riches. So using tools like language, the English language here, governance, systems and things like maps, countries such as the UK were able to simply take lands as their own and rule them, such as in India, or live in and populate them, like in the US. When that began to break apart in the late 1950s, political systems as well as art and literature had to imagine a new world after the colonizer left. Imagine that it's your life, right? And someone, just after someone has taken complete control of you for your entire memory. Would you try and go back in time to a time before? Would you look for justice? Or would you just want to move forward? Writers like Achebe, who were writing around Nigeria's independence, were vital to the country's conception of itself. After independence, they had to decide, what is our national identity? What do we want to remember? What should we forget? Should we move on or look back? And why? The colonization of Africa is more explicit in terms of plot in the second half of Things Fall Apart, but it hangs around kind of the edges of this story all the way through. And what's important is what Achebe was trying to achieve in writing it, just a couple of years before they got their official independence in Nigeria in 1960. But we also need to remember that African history does not begin and end on contact with Europe. It is diverse, it is long-standing, it has cultural practices which nestle in value systems which might be a little bit new to us. So before we try to reckon with the colonial history of Africa, we first need to consider what was there before. We need to do what Achebe did and think about what Africanness is and what was important to preserve. And I find a great place to start is to consider the Empire of Mali, which existed in the 13th to around the 15th century in an area not far from where Achebe is writing, as you can see on the map, just a few hundred years later. But before we get into that, I'd like you to think about some ideas that you associate with West Africa, or Africa in general. And I want you to take a moment to note down 3 adjectives that you would use to describe Africa. So, a few words may have come to mind. You might have thought of nature and landscapes, music, food, any other cultural practices. Maybe more on the negative side, you thought of pollution in cities or natural areas like the Niger Delta, overpopulation, deforestation, maybe things about religious war or militias. Maybe it made you think of a charity ad you saw with some kind of graphic images of famine or infant mortality. And those tend to be the responses that I get to that question when I do this class. And all of those concepts that we associate with this area of the world come from the images we tend to receive of Africa. Many of the narratives around Africa in the last 50 years have focused on this sense of helplessness and poverty, of victimhood. It is spread, sometimes through good intentions, on charity campaigns, international news, and religious missions. That's not to mention the homogenization of Africa, right? Grouping it into one story, which I'm even doing now, right? Asking you to define a continent in 3 adjectives. So we need to deconstruct that a little bit. And what I'd like you to do to get started is to follow that QR code that's on the screen. If you've done a preparation for paper 1 of IB, you should be pretty used to this now, but I'd like you to read through that article and think about the key arguments that it brings up. And then we're going to discuss that here. So follow that QR code now and we'll talk about it. So the article was about Mansa Musa, who was king of the Mali Empire and who was known to be the richest man in history, ever, owning the equivalent of over 400 billion US dollars. That's what you learn on that article there, that they've adjusted for inflation, right? He would have been considerably richer than the world's current billionaires, right? That article is a little bit old, but even updated in 2023, when I'm recording this, even billionaires like Elon Musk and Bezos, depending on what metric you're using, tend to come with a wealth of around 200 billion. On Mansa Musa's pilgrimage in 1324 to Mecca, he was rumoured to have brought with him over 100 camels loaded with gold. And we know about that from various written accounts from Europeans he encountered along the way. He created this image of Africa in the European imagination as early as the 1300s, where many writers were talking about his ridiculous wealth. We can also think about Sankore University, which, if you'd like to learn more, is again on that reading list at the beginning, which still stands today. The picture is in the background here. It was built for 25,000 students in Timbuktu, and students tended to study Arabic as well as maths and poetry, and tended to be there for around 10 years before they graduated, which I think tells us something about the value of education in Mali and the access people had to education, just by the scale of how big that school was and the fact that it's still standing today. A useful question might be, are you surprised by the life of Mansa Musa and the history of the Empire of Mali? Think about those adjectives you gave at the beginning. Did anything about this story contradict any of those ideas? So where do those contradictions come from? I'd like you to think of 3 reasons why this history might have been fairly widely forgotten in mainstream history. Pause this video and have a think about some of those reasoning. So if you watched one of the videos on the reading list, which was a crash course video with John Green, he outlined this pretty well. First of all, we've got destruction of the empire, right? A loss of physical artifacts when the British Empire came in. So we lost a lot of the physical objects that could tell us about this time. Next, we have the oral tradition. So that means a culture whereby things aren't recorded on physical paper or stone, but instead are passed down orally through speech through different generations, which means we don't have many surviving records. And I'd certainly recommend John Green's crash course video to hear his arguments about the oral tradition. And finally, the Eurocentric perspective. We might be guilty sometimes of prioritising European history, or at least domestic European history. And furthermore, maybe it doesn't fit with those narratives of Africa that we thought about at the beginning of this session. So often the continent is associated with victimhood, right? As underdeveloped, as a place of poverty and famine. And when we do that, we create this story where the Europeans are powerful. The white people in the story are in control, and it paints Africa as a continent of weakness. That said, we do need to also talk about the ways in which West Africa has been traumatised by colonialism. We won't spend too long thinking about the transatlantic slave trade since it doesn't come up directly in the story. However, it is something that Achebe is responding to as a part of post-colonial literature. If you don't know much about the transatlantic slave trade, I'd really like you to do some research from that reading list, because it's completely vital to understanding European history as well as contemporary European American politics. It's central to the demands of a lot of social justice movements because it began this legitimization of racism and prejudice that manifests today as police brutality and mass incarceration. So let's just think about it very briefly. First of all, think about the word transatlantic. What does that mean? Well, trans means to go across, right? Like transport, or translate, to go across two things. And the Atlantic here refers to the Atlantic Ocean. So we're talking about a slave trade that happened across the Atlantic Ocean. I've got an animation here which shows the typical passage of the transatlantic slave trade. As we know, Europe had been trading with Africa for a number of years throughout, for instance, the Empire of Mali. This process also didn't happen in one moment, nor was it only one country involved, but generally, when we think about the slave trade, we're considering the era around the sort of 18th century, and the version we're talking about that became mechanized and established was by the British, right? And this was the buying and selling of people on a massive industrial scale. So the first boats came from Europe, in this case the UK, containing goods to trade to North Africa, usually things like weaponry. African people were then taken from their villages in West Africa, so that's places like Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, now all along this coast, and put onto boats for the Middle Passage. This is perhaps the most famous and brutal part of the slave trade, which is the 2-month journey across the Atlantic, in which the slaves were packed below deck. Shackled together, they were unable to move, sit up, or even go to the bathroom, and a lot of them died from disease on that passage. It ended in the Caribbean, so that's Jamaica, Barbados, which was land already taken by the British and cultivated for farming. A similar thing also happens in the US, southern states. The goods were then taken back to sell in the UK for profit, so that's things like cotton and sugar generally. So the way this is important to our studies of things fall apart, not only is vital to understanding post-colonial studies, we need to think about what it tells us about the ways African people were seen. Right? They were seen as goods to be traded to be profited from. I've mentioned social justice like Black Lives Matter in the US. In what other ways has the slave trade had knock-on effects in the world? Can you think of any that are present in Things Fall Apart? So how had the opinion of Africans changed by the time of the missionaries, the Christians, in Things Fall Apart? So that's around the 1890s, turn of the century. What about by the time Achebe's writing in the 1950s? And what about now in the 2020s? So we'll jump forwards a little bit now to the end of the slave trade. And this is where we get really relevant to this story. We're going to talk about the Berlin Conference, which happened in 1882. I'll come to a timeline later so this doesn't get too confusing. What I want you to do, though, is just take a look at this cartoon. I'd like you to have a go at interpreting it. What are we looking at here? What's the story of this cartoon? Pause this video and have a think. Label who you think these characters are, what they're doing, and what it represents, what it could represent in history, right? So, who have we got here? Well, if you've studied much history before, you might recognise this as the Kaiser of Germany with that cross. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. But we can see here that they are dividing up a cake, which has got Africa written on it in French. How are they presented? Well, there's a group around them that are all pretty old-looking, white, European, well-dressed men. So who do they represent? Well, we could safely assume that they're England and France, these characters here. They're sort of caricatures. So straight away this is making sense to us as the European countries dividing up Africa to share, right? To be given a slice of cake. But let's go a step further then. Why is this a cake, right? Why not show a map? Why not show the map that they're actually using? Why not another metaphor like, I don't know, like a saw, sawing a log? Why a cake? Why this image? Well, in my opinion, it's because it shows this action as something quite trivial, right? This is a party. These men are gathered around waiting for a treat, right? Waiting for a delicious slice of cake. You know, it's something that is kind of trivial, right? Almost inconsequential. And yet the knife also shows us that there's an idea of violence there, right? We often use the phrase in English, a piece of cake, to denote something that is easy. It's not a big deal. So the characters here are literally being given a piece, a slice of Africa. Africa is the cake, and it is being divided at the will of Germany there, who's pointing at the cake. It's being divided along arbitrary lines. So I think we can guess what the Berlin Conference was, right? We're going to look at it more in a second. But it was the continent of Africa being divvied up between different European countries. Do you think that the cartoonist was in support of the Berlin Conference? I would say probably not. I mean, these caricatures, well, these characters are caricatured, right? They kind of look pathetic, all these ones here looking up. They've got these over-exaggerated features, right? I'm a European, I could recognise England and France pretty easily by their over-exaggerated features. The idea that it's trivialised as a piece of cake, I think the cartoonist is telling us that they found it way too easy to divide Africa up. And so this so-called Scramble for Africa was a conference that took place in Berlin in Germany, at which point Nigeria was officially put under British rule. So that means the locals were forced to speak English at school, local cultures were decimated, and Christianity was kind of used as a tool in this as well, which we'll consider when we look at the themes, especially in the second half of the novel. Remember, this is the Nigeria in which Achebe was growing up, from 1930 when he was born to when Nigeria got its independence. So this story is vital to the lives of Okonkwo and his family in the story, and to Achebe's writing. In Penguin's introduction to the edition of Things Fall Apart, they consider the role of the Berlin Conference in Achebe's writing. If you have a similar copy to me, you might have this introduction at the beginning of your copy of Things Fall Apart, where the writer talks about the debilitating psychosis of the Berlin Conference, where countries were divided along arbitrary lines, as it says, atomized and divided into states, no longer by a shared culture, but by the European flag, which now held sway over them. The lines that we can see on the right here were often drawn to make sense on a European map, to make sense of Africa from above. They often corresponded to deposits of natural resources like gold and diamonds, and were negotiated to fulfill the financial requirements of the countries at the table, right? In reality, cultures are not divided along straight lines, perhaps by language or tribe, often geographical features like rivers or mountains or trade routes. Have a think about what kind of effect this would have had on people in terms of identity, in terms of logistics, right, of living in that country, language, ethnicity, and war. Groups were forced to live together while others were split apart, governed by a different system, different language, and different laws across seemingly random lines. And we still see the effects of that today. But let's go back to Things Fall Apart. If you've read through the book already, can you think of any place where the division of the land is clear? Perhaps not directly, maybe you can. Remember what Achebe is doing here is reminding us, though, that history doesn't need to follow the conventions of a European attitude, right, of looking at history from above and looking back, but instead shows us the experience of African people. So let's take a look at how all of this fits together, because I've picked some, a few different parts from different parts of history, and I've really only covered a tiny slice, but I'm hoping that it will have been somewhat relevant. So we've got the Empire of Mali here, which went on for, a few hundred years, and right at the beginning of that was Mansa Musa, and overlaps with the transatlantic slave trade, which started really at the beginning of the 1600s-ish, and continues for a few hundred years. The Berlin Conference is in 1884, so after the end of the slave trade. And Achebe writes Things Fall Apart, 70-something years later, right? 60-something years later. He sets Things Fall Apart around 1890, so just after the Berlin Conference. So why does Achebe choose to set his story then? Okonkwo is born just after the Berlin Conference, and the events of the story take place over the 30 years following, as Britain is taking a stronger hold of Nigerian society. Things are falling apart. The final thing I want to mention is if you are doing higher level, you could have a think about this poem, The Second Coming, by W.B. Yeats. This is the poem from which Achebe took the title, Things Fall Apart. It's a poem that was written in 1919. And if you've studied this period in any detail, you'll know that around the turn of the century, so by that I mean 1900, people began to feel as if the whole structure of civilization was changing. A milestone which hadn't been experienced in living memory. New technology, modern and abstract art, the very beginnings of things like jazz music, inspired by, and I guess contributing to this notion, artists were making these strange new things and people were changing. And crucially, people were becoming less Christian. Time was moving forward. Too much was happening. There were too many people, too many places. The world was becoming oversaturated with stories and conflicting ideas. There was no longer one narrative, one story we could all live by. It felt to many as if things were falling apart. Yeats imagines this as a falcon, turning and turning and spinning from a tight spiral into chaos. And if you want to explore this idea in more detail, I think it could be excellent for like a higher level essay. You could have a think about why Achebe is using this poem as his namesake. What do the falcon and the falconer represent for a Okonkwo story? Are there any other lines he could have used? Or, why is Achebe even using a European, an Irish poet? And what role does Christianity play in this poem versus Things Fall Apart? Do the writers feel differently about the second coming? Make sure to take another look at that reading list and make sure you're clear on everything that I've talked about today. If you want to do this for your individual oral, it might be a good idea to look at the more contemporary applications of this story. But understanding this history will be useful not only for this novel, but for any novels you want to consider for your exam and beyond.